Good afternoon, everyone. So let's resume our conference. So in the second session, we're going to talk about data economics and political participation in the interconnected society. I'd like to invite Marcos Dantas. He is from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, as well as from the Brazilian Steering Committee, CGI.br. Mr. Rafael Evangelista, he is a professor at the Campinas University. He's also the author of a book that addresses also the use of internet and democracy. And Ms. Madeleine de Cock Buning from the Utrecht University. So I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Dantas. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see you. Well, I had no idea I was going to be the moderator of this session. Nobody ever told me that. I thought I was going to come up here and give a talk. Well, so let me open this panel. I have a presentation, but I'm going to be the last one to talk. I'd rather listen to my two colleagues. Well, I've just met Professor Madeleine. It was really a pleasure to meet you. So let's start our discussion. I do not know how much time we have. How much time do we have? So how much time do we have? 25 minutes? 30 minutes for each speaker? Wow, great. I love when somebody allows me to speak for 30 minutes. Would you like to start? Anybody?
You can start now.
What about you, Professor Madeleine? All right, so let's have Rafael. Rafael was already introduced.
Pessoal, boa tarde.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by thanking CGI and NIC.br for the invitation. I find this an extremely important issue. Well, in order to try to organize myself, I have a script here, but I'll try to speak very slowly. And please stop me at any time. So I'd like to start by discussing a word that was used early this morning, disorder. What does it mean when you say that we are experiencing what we call information disorder? Are we talking about what? The vaccines? Or xenophobia, homophobia, intolerance. These would be some of the negative impact that we find when it comes to information disorder. But what would be the order if we had good information order? So that would mean that citizens would be protected against these anti-scientific and anti-democratic ideas. Perhaps the entire planet would be better protected by citizens who would fight based on science and also protecting diversity. I believe that perhaps I'm having some issues with my mic. No? Well, so it seems that there's also an expectation of having a political environment in which we have different stakeholders, experts, academia, groups that advocate for minorities, present. So all these stakeholders would be able to discuss issues that are important to the general public. So this is a highly, it's an idea that comes from enlightenment, and it takes argumentation. We do have a set of rules that stem from that, the right for information, regulation, so that we have the appropriate use and flow of the media. Obviously, it takes freedom of expression. So when we say that if you don't have the protection of these rights, that already represents an issue. But that becomes a bigger issue when you think about the global south, in which we have a more fragile environment. Countries that were colonized and countries that are new. So that led to a very fragile implementation of the democratic rules. And I think that we are experiencing that right now. Well, the Portuguese philosopher Santos mentioned that there is also an Eurocentrism. So that would be a tribalism of the European bourgeois that comes from earlier centuries. And that what we have today is just a theoretical concept. But what we see is a tremendous gap between the colonies and the metropolis. And there are certain things that would not even be considered for the colonies, not because that would be impossible, but because it comes from this division between societies. So we have this gap, this divide, and that's why it's so hard for us to implement these utopic means of running public affairs. So we all know that the histories of these societies are also very different, and that would lead us to even lead us to think that there's something wrong going to the global south. So the wrong and the imperfection takes place in the south, and not this asymmetric use of power. So this is what the philosopher Boaventura actually mentioned. But we need to think about how this healthy functionality of the public environment, or how much that environment will be perfect. And secondly, the public environment is an ideation that leads to an always ongoing project, a project that is still being built. And we also need to take into account that it's important that we bear in mind our past as a colony. So if we intend to build anything that is similar to the European model, we need to take into account all the differences. We need to think about our history, so the power asymmetry with the North, and also the fragility of our institutions. As for political participation, particularly elections, what we see is not that the rules are bad. No, on the contrary, I'm not a specialist, but I believe that we do have good rules when it comes to elections. However, we did face issues in 2018, and perhaps we could have them reduced if the institutions were strong enough and were able to apply punishment. What we saw is that all the investigation took place very, very slowly. But there are two other factors I'd like to add when it comes to the difficulty in regulating this disorder. This takes some global factors, even if we experience them right here. One, neoliberalism. According to Harvey, this is a theory of the political economical practices proposing that human well-being can be improved if we consider individual entrepreneurship, and that is also marked by free market, free trade, and private properties. But these neoliberalism ideas actually became more diverged from this definition. And in Brazil, for example, we really failed in implementing welfare. So today, what we see is that citizens and companies are working as if we were able to them build something stronger. So the legitimation of a clandestine situation. So neoliberalism is a theory, but it's also the way you see the world, your attitude. So Harvey says that nothing will become really strong and present if it does not portray our needs, our wishes, and also the environment in which we live in. So the order, going back to the disorder, so the order that is targeted by neoliberalists is an utopia, as an automatic self-organization that stems from chaos. I believe that the word automatic is very important, because if you expect conflicts to be resolved by themselves, and also to talk about self-regulating organizations. So you're talking about external intervention and planning. So this is how neoliberalism represents a power that leads us to avoid talking about organizing our system. But if we go back to Harvey, there is another complicator for regulation, more specifically towards technology. Richard Barbrook defines what he called California ideology as a gathering of ideas that came from the hip culture at the Silicon Valley in California. And that gave rise to an optimistic view of new technologies by bringing together freedom plus entrepreneurship from the 90s. So neoliberalism applied to the internet. So any regulation would decrease the power of companies, and it would be also a means to prevent freedom. It seems to be a very simple idea, but it was highly debated. So today what we see is that all these assumptions are being discussed again, particularly when we think about the strength of the platforms we have. So I believe that that allows us to understand why we need, or we feel that we need, order, and also to have a humanistic political participation. But we do have a weak regulatory framework and a very weak state that is becoming weaker and weaker vis-a-vis pressure coming from the public. And this seminar also addresses disinformation. And to me, this word is tied to the idea of disorder. It's very interesting to see that the word is in English, well, but in Portuguese, disinformation, or somebody who is not informed, is the person who lacks information. But disinformation means that you do have information, but not the right information. It's tied to untruthful information. Whereas in Portuguese, when you say desinformação, that may lead people to think that you have no information at all. But both disinformation and misinformation are problems. But it's important that we separate them, that we distinguish them in order to fight each one of them, and then regulate or put an order in them. So to me, misinformation is a byproduct that actually feeds back and actually powers the platforms. maybe this is not what they meant to have. But so poor information is more popular amongst people. It generates more click. It also enhances emotions. It's more entertaining than truthful information. And because of that, because poor information or disinformation, misinformation, because they generate so many clicks, well, the platforms respond to them as if they were part of the normalcy. So that became a business, not only for political use, but also when you think about financial use. When you say it's not a bug, it's a feature. I do not know if you have ever heard about that, but this is highly applicable because that leads this information to benefit from what we have implemented. I'm going to give you two examples. One that took place in Brazil. Well, in the US, for example, alternative influence broadcasting reactionary writing in YouTube. So that was by Rebecca Lewis. And they map what she called alternative media map. So how people actually use them in order to increase audience, and that involves internet celebrities, academia. It goes from highly conservative to all different shades of what we have. The study demonstrates how these agents work in order to share their popularity. For example, the most moderate member will invite somebody who is a more extremist. And although they disagree, the audience of the guy who's moderate will get very excited by the content, by the controversy. And the fans of the extremist will also benefit because it will also attract more audience. And they also address the financial benefits. Even if it does not come from the platform and number of views, these people from the right wing will benefit just by having audience. Let's say they were banned from YouTube, but let's say they may start crowdfunding and get some money. So the platform will ban those that became more popular and visible to the general audience, those that can actually raise funds by using some alternative means. But these people actually will try to portray themselves as somebody who is suffering. So YouTube banned me, so please help me in raising funds so that I can fight for freedom. Right now, I do not have, anything like that, but there are some indications that that's happening also in Brazil. This is more severe in Brazil because we have here things that are in the hands of very few in the traditional media. So, for example, commentators from traditional media and these extremists, and that actually enhances the legitimacy of extremists here in Brazil. So let me talk about the Brazilian example and the use of WhatsApp.
I'll make some comments based on what the press advocated for public information, scientists of information, and also due to some geographic information that I'm getting from some WhatsApp group that's an unhealthy type of work that I have been doing since the truck striker that took place last year. So both groups, they have been talking, discussing, and in general lines, the traditional media content is present for legitimacy of information and what is supposed to be wrong in terms of cultural Marxism. And this is present in the major media, and it ends up being available at WhatsApp groups. But let me talk about a work conducted by a group from the Computer Science University, and that is the leader of the paper. I do not know if he's the author of the research, but at least he's in charge of that paper, charge for the paper. They had monitored several WhatsApp discussion groups that started back with the truck strike. At that time, they monitored over 300 discussion groups trying to understand what is called misinformation. There is wrong information, which may be false and which may be conveyed by different people. They talked about network emergency that takes place between groups where they try to identify content traffic by information which is proved to be false. And those groups which apparently they are not connected, they are in fact some members of different groups. They are present at several others. Some groups, they have different arrays with similar members. Within themselves, they create a parallel framework which is invisible and not perceived by an isolated member of that group. Let's say your uncle that is part of your family WhatsApp group, he believes that all members are just like he is, but in fact there are some members responsible for controlling the information flow. And with that invisibility in mind, there are surveillance framework, users framework that are participating as part of a certain group. And WhatsApp users within that context, they perform the role similarly to any other social media. And images that they show fake news or fake information, they have been broadcasted much more frequently than any other image. Those images which apparently have fake content, they became much more popular than any other type of image which was not necessarily supposed to be fake information or pictures. Let me just emphasize two very important aspects. We have to understand WhatsApp groups not just as instantaneous messengers, but rather as a type of social media group. We also have to add information brought by a newspaper from São Paulo during elections. Entrepreneurs, they had up to $3 million agreements with automated messages drivers. Most of those businessmen, they act in the retail market. That allows to replicate their market actions and bring them to a political settings. Those companies, they were forbidden to participate at this campaign, but unfortunately that took place parallel to the law. I mean, that non-official type of support. During political campaigns, it's illegal to sell commercial marketing practices, but unfortunately that was added to the political marketing. The candidate had a mailing of his own company, which was also shared during the marketing campaign. In addition to the newspaper publication, they talk about an informal and formal type of marketing, which promotes different messages throughout different apps. And still agencies, they may reach information shared by employees where they are not allowed to participate at groups. And I witnessed that any WhatsApp groups which I participate at, which are controlled by the right part, moderators usually they apply international ID numbers. In addition to sending individualized messages, they also have a anonymous group management, which becomes invisible to our regular users. A WhatsApp group, it seems to be a spontaneous type of work, but in fact, that's not quite the case because there is always someone behind it monitoring that WhatsApp group. Managers, they apply algorithms which will divide groups between supporters, detractors, and neutrals. With that, they define which type of content will be sent. I understand that you are all aware of that information. You have heard and read about that, but it's my role here to emphasize it and remind you about all this mess. And those moderators, they were hired to create additional groups in favor of that candidate. And some of the groups, they simulate an army group where they self-identify themselves as being a virtual army in favor of that such candidate. And they are divided as brigades and battles where youngsters participate, most of them younger than 18 years of age. What can we take from this example and apply or make any convergence to our reality? We have fake information being spread all over. And there are two vectors. First, we have that globalized sphere, which became a global institution, and it becomes harder to make that available in favor of a real liberalism, which considers that power dimension among players. In a context like ours, in the South Global scenario, that becomes even harder. In Brazil, the disinformation disorder is enhanced by communication mass medias. We cannot understand misinformation or sharing, or the misinformation sharing, just based on the real logics of this new type of media, the so-called internet, social media, WhatsApp groups, and so on. We should understand and analyze that as part of a messy and unregulated communication means. We thought that internet could be a shortcut to solve media concentration problems without impairing the power in place. We no longer need to regulate internet. We will allow that everybody will be able to express themselves throughout the different channels, and with that we'll have a possibility to have a higher communication means access, an access which has been denied for so long. So communication would be promoted throughout technology, and that we have the surveillance capitalism, and we had capture, attention, and care, leading to continuous stimuli, exploring emotions, and to mobilize a great number of people. And the logics behind that is far away from exposition and any sort of narrative. Algorithms by themselves, they will become so radical, they instigate and they fascinate throughout conspirations. And below platforms, which I guess is one of the evidences that is proved by WhatsApp, we have hatred, where radical YouTubers are present, communication, pro-military intervention, the radicalists, and together with this sort of business, as those who are experts in marketing via WhatsApp, we have a marketing mix-up elections to commercial issues. My time is almost up, but let me close by raising a timely comment, and which is quite related to the previous session. I believe that there's new ways throughout the technologies, platforms, and governmental agencies have faced in terms of big data, growth, governance, development, and by that I mean not only state members, but also a technology where we have communities governance, governance of the social environment, takes us to a certain level of rupture, which may somehow explain that lack of ability to defeat misinformation. What have we been doing so far, in addition to acts and laws, especially those that were not helpful at all, we have seen several agencies verifying facts. And my main point here, which I understand is quite complex, those fact agencies, they still operate with a human being which is understood as being a rational human being from the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, which is a being which becomes educated and an active human being. Powers that are dealing with us, otherwise, they guide us differently. And with that, you may understand at what extent such inefficiency in verifying the real truth. And by that, I mean the way that things have been working, that is not the matter anymore. What I really care about is what favors my group, what will stimulate my hatred, my love, and my desires. This is a very difficult discussion. I agree, as it is so philosophical, as we have to include this new sort of toolkit which we became objects from, leading to a number of problems that will be hardly solved, as that will require a second attempt, which is not only to understand that subject, but to restore and understand the subjects which have been changing due to technological advancements and social changes. I apologize if I made that so complex, but that's it for now. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Rafael. That was a brilliant discussion addressing the public spheres and how that can be deployed and applied in a peripheral country, and what are the asymmetries among nations, and as part of our current network context, where we have give reason to a discussion about a public sphere. Thank you so much for your comments and contribution. Now, please, you have the floor, Professor Madeleine.
How can we, profit from all that wealth in a good way? And there was one topic that I didn't talk about extensively in my keynote this morning, and that was the action plan the European Commission rolled out before the European elections. And I think it's good for you guys to realize what actual things were done and whether they were successful or not. Also, if you will be talking also tomorrow and other days in other groups about how you could deal with this, given the fact, and this was for me very enlightening, that of course the situation here is very different. But there are some key elements that I think that we all have in common. To fight disinformation or to respond properly to disinformation, a better way to put it, I would say, first of all, is cooperation. And this is also a very important element of the action plan. We have to cooperate. And this can be states that can coordinate. For instance, the rapid alert system, that was a system that was a result of the action plan of the European Union, and that gave the opportunity to, if there were disinformation threats going on, for instance, well, I talk about the Indian-Pakistan example, but we can, easily think of an example like that, like a hypothetical example with regard to, for instance, like there is a bombing. Germany has landed a bomb in the Netherlands, and that happened just an hour ago. So this, well, we will probably know that this is disinformation, at least I hope very much for my relative. And then this kind of disinformation threats could be fact-checked and then shared with other countries. And this could be European countries, but it could also be pan-European. And this kind of information, disinformation stories can also be useful to share for in the United States of America or Brazil. So that it's sharing of information on what kind of stories are, there to have disinformation, what kind of ways of spreading disinformation. All those things you can coordinate between member states of the EU, but also beyond the state. That is already helpful. And then, of course, the transparency element is a very important element that is relevant for all kinds of elections, and we already spoke about that just now, but there was one thing I learned after my presentation, and that was a lady representing Facebook. She told me, you know what, this global transparency campaign on electoral information, that is in fact rolled out globally and not just in Europe. So I said, okay, that's good news. So Facebook is doing this transparency campaign on what is transparent and how does it work with European election information or election information in these countries. And then she told me, well, it is not enforced here. So it is there, but it's not yet enforced. So I can imagine this afternoon there will also be someone of Facebook that can maybe talk about why not and how it has been dealt with. So that would be an element. Then data protection would be an element. And of course, and this is a topic we didn't speak about a lot as well yet today, cybersecurity, of course, is also very important. Because if cybersecurity is breached, then you would not know anymore the source. So you have to always balance the actions towards this information with cybersecurity issues, and then consider at the end of the day appropriate sanctions. And before you would get at the appropriate sanctions, because what would they amount to, you would need to set standards. What kind of sanctions are possible? And I will go through the action plan very shortly with you so that you would know what the action plan actually entailed. First of all, there was an element about improving detection, analysis, and exposure of disinformation. So then again, the focus was on finding out what was going on. Well, and then, as I already indicated, strongly connected to that is a stronger cooperation and a joint response. And for that, a rapid alert system is set up to provide alerts on disinformation, and member states will designate within each member state an institution that could do things with this rapid alert notifications and inform their citizens that this is going on. Okay. And then mobilize the private sector to tackle disinformation. That is the third element of the action plan, which is the implementation of the code of practice we just spoke about this morning. Take regulatory action against these platforms should there be unsatisfactory results. And I can imagine that this last element is something that you guys would like to say for this afternoon's discussions. And then also the last element of the action plan is raise awareness and improve societal resilience. So you will recognize some elements of the things we have been talking about this morning, but it's very much arranged for making elections more trustworthy and getting the right potential out of the information that can be spread in a very positive way throughout the online digital atmosphere. And this is something I think we should really realize. It's very positive, but we should take right measures to make it positive also for the future, because I can imagine that there are very large parts of, and I also know, because I learned that from the research I have been told about yesterday by Nick, is that many areas in Brazil would not have access to newspapers probably, but they would have access to mobile phones, and in these mobile phones is a wealth of information that is very relevant for making choices also for these people. So that's what I would like to share with you at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, international cooperation and cybersecurity in addressing these global issues. That's very, very important. Thank you very much for adding these 2 points. Well, I have shared these in some other seminars, so some of you may be tired of listening to this. The entire discussion, or in my hypothesis, should be based on some political, economical rules. We discuss politics, we talk about best practices, we discuss a set of potential international agreements. Obviously, they are part of that, but there are some economic, financial powers that are extremely strong. And I would say that, well, we can discuss, for example, how fast things are taking place, the content, but it's important that you are guided by something. And that's why I think that we need to discuss on what we can do. Let's think about it as a train going somewhere, right? We need to discuss, can we perhaps change the means of transportation? To me, the first idea is that after we had Snowden's report, after the scandal involving Cambridge Analytica, that we can no longer be naive with regard to what happens. All the powers that are present here and how they are using the networks in order to organize society, leading society to a specific direction. We can no longer be naive when it comes to the internet. Snowden and the Cambridge Analytica scandal made it very clear. What happened in the Brazilian elections, for example, made it very clear that we need to watch out. All of you who here in this room, you know that anything you do involving your smartphone or your computer, that this is going to be somehow captured. These activities will be used by the different platforms and they will be used to market something. And since then, a large group of platforms, YouTube, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Uber, all of them will actually gather these activities for market purposes. But when desirable, these also the same pieces of information will also be uptaken by some intelligence services, such as the US, for example. So a while ago, let's say 2 years ago, The Economist published they published an issue talking about how data is today the most valuable resource, how our behavior, our activities are the most valuable resource available. And that's why everything we do is somehow now used for market purposes. These platforms are used just as if you had they are used in the marketplace. And why is that? Because it doesn't matter where you are or how far you are from places. It doesn't matter, for example, if you think about the time, time duration it takes for performing a transaction. It's just as if you were in the Middle Ages. You could go to the public square to exchange ideas, to talk about your life, or to sell, or to buy, to be entertained, whatever. So it became this large public square or the marketplace, and that became really, it allowed these companies to actually to trade. And in 2017, data actually was responsible for a world market of $365 billion. And all the 20 largest internet platforms altogether, they represent more than $3.8 trillion. And why is that? Well, because if you think about the reasoning of a business, any person in the past, if they want to sell something, they would have to go to the market and then wait for some time till a consumer go to that store and then close the deal and then wait a little bit so to receive your payment. Everybody knows this expression, time is money. And the capitalism, the modern capitalism, since it was developed at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, things happen like that. And time is important, time is money. But today, the networks, well, TV and radio, they already did that. But if you think about digital networks, at least when it comes to information and even some market transactions, you can reduce this time to perform this transaction 2 seconds. You do not need to go to a travel agency, for example, to talk about which hotel you want to stay. You can just open your laptop and then in seconds you choose a hotel. It doesn't matter where that hotel is located, Germany, Japan, it doesn't matter. It takes just a couple of seconds for you to actually make a reservation, and then in a couple of seconds, my money, my credit card is already into somebody else's account, right? So it's very, very easy. And that's why these type of information is so valuable. So I call that this zero limit rotation time. To me, this is what we see taking place right now. So here you have an algorithm that processes data coming from the two ends of the market, the buyer, the seller, and they are actually the interface at the time zero, they are getting together, but at the same time, there is an algorithm that is gathering data from the buyer and from the seller. Because this is done, this transaction is carried out by an algorithm. The algorithm actually provides information to the two ends. Algorithms are also used in auctions. It's an auction of words and images. And at the very end, it favors the closing of a deal. And then you transfer your money to the financial market using your credit card, for example. So platforms now reduced this rotation time for when you think about where the money is going to, right? At the T0, it really takes just a couple of seconds. Well, in order to enhance the value of this algorithm, it's important that you have billion users all the time, feeding the information, right? What I like, what I dislike, what I'm doing, what I am, what I'm buying. And the algorithm will actually uptake all this information. And the more information, the better they will actually benefit the two ends, sellers and buyers. So we are actually giving this value free of charge. We are offering all this information without being paid, and we are offering these to these platform algorithms. And this free work. Rafael, my colleague who's here, called that as more value 2.0. So actually, I'm using this expression now, Rafael. Well, who's behind the platforms? It's the added value 2.0. Well, Google. We have 1,700 institutions that actually are responsible for their shares. You can also see the number here of organizations that are actually those that actually hold most of this company's shares. So the shareholders, you can see. So you can see the groups, Vanguard Group, Vanguard Group, in all the three companies. You can see here, PFMR, State Street. You can see the same investors. So the same groups control the capital of these different digital platforms that are competing against themselves. So there is a tremendous financial interest involved. And you can see that all that value that's being generated are going to these companies. And these companies are actually setting what is being discussed, even hatred speeches. Well, 2016, Google actually distributed $19.5 billion to its shareholders. I'm talking about the profit. I'm not talking about revenue. Yesterday, for example, in Brazil, the Brazilian oil company distribution was also sold. You can see here how much Google has benefited by obtaining our data. Facebook paid $3.7 billion to shareholders. Amazon, $2.4 billion to shareholders. So as you can see that the 21st century oil is a highly profitable market based on data. And that's why investors and finance companies are investing in these companies. But it's also important to bear in mind that we are in Brazil. Well, data belongs to me, to you, but Google and Facebook are profiting from that. So we are transferring wealth of our activities. And that is not controlled, that's actually ignored. Doesn't matter if in Brazil or so, all this wealth is going from Brazil to New York or to London. So we are concentrating wealth. So, and that's why 1% of the world's population is responsible or holds 50% of the world's wealth. So my conclusions. Well, in the past, it was thought that the internet would be a public environment, but that was the idea when the internet was used by the academia, by liberals, by reasonable people, usually guided by positivism, because that were Cartesian people, mathematicians, scientists, engineers. But then internet started to be also used by NGOs, and we thought that then the debate was going to go towards a more humanistic view. Well, if we had a neutral use of that, then we would have discussions that would take place just as if you were in a public square. But today, things are not like that anymore. The internet is actually accessed and used by billions of people. It also became a forum for people to express themselves, either positive or negative. They express their wishes, their wants, their frustrations, obviously tied to also expressing the different groups, the wealthier, the poorest. But it also became, above all, a marketplace. And what's important here is that it's generating value. And that's why the algorithm works better and better. And although we still have some segments that still try to resist to that. For example, Wikipedia. Today, the internet is being organized by these large platforms. Well, we had a conference a while ago, and we saw how these large companies were actually leading the debate about regulation. We can no longer think or see the internet as we saw it at the very beginning. Because today, this is the internet. The internet is like a city. In the past, we would say, well, you would access the internet and then you had to call a number. But today, no, it's not. Well, in the past, you would have to hang up that call in order to make a phone call. But today, you don't need any like that, right? It's not a dialed internet. And if you actually do not turn off your laptop, you're going to be on the internet day and night. And that's why we need to treat the internet as we treat a city, with the rules that actually guide the society, as an urban network. And we know that we need rules. Some are just etiquette rules or education rules, but there are also rules that are imposed by the organizations that have the right to impose rules, the state. So the organization of a public space cannot be disorganized. It needs to be organized. It needs order.
And how can we put that into reality? Well, we see now internet as being a technical network, a layer of application, service, content provider. People are no longer in the web. They are in the Spotify, YouTube, WhatsApp, Facebook, Google, Gmail. In the past, I would surf in the internet, but not anymore. Now I access Android, and below that first layer, we have the so-called technical infrastructure. And Nick.br manages that with a great level of competence, such as CDNs, protocols, registries, and below that layer we have the telco layer, which is the physical layer for the signal traffic. And now we have to understand the whole framework, the structure of the internet. And once we get that idea, we have to understand that a regulatory approach for the internet should consider all these layers, especially the business layer, which may be, and that is available in the literature, that is an evidence, and that may be shared between evidence producers such as Facebook, Twitter, platforms based on advertisement, replacing the previous radio broadcasters, the market platforms that get organized to close some business deals, such as Amazon and others, and eventually those platforms which coordinate the market, and it helps with any sort of monetary or financial deals, such as PayPal. That can be a type of taxonomy to organize our mind behind this type of debate. And over that main layer, we have the internet layer followed by the telco layer. That is one of the layers of the internet which becomes neutral as to contents, where data will go, will have that traffic or transit among different organizations. And I think now, as any other Brazilian citizen, despite everything else which has been done, I still see that as a Brazilian man, where we participate, where there is a network known as international jurisdiction. No one in this room should ignore debates addressing different jurisdiction, but we have a current debate which is being talked at different networks, where sometimes the justices should block a WhatsApp due to a criminal issue, where that should be much more intertwined to political and economic issues, including strategic geopolitical issues. And then we have an example such as China, which has full sovereignty over their internet, and the Russian case, which is discussing upon become total responsible for their internet to allocate sovereignty, where internet will lose that main principle and will become isolated, as well as the European community, which is being discussing about a number of regulatory initiatives considering European interests, including data registries, personal data protection. I remember listening to Macron's during the IGF in Paris, the President Macron, which mentioned during the IGF that they should not follow neither a Californian nor a Chinese type of approach, but rather a liberal approach, which is so common among European countries. And Brazil has accrued, thanks to CGI, BR, the debate that has been fostered around the legal civil framework, where the idea was to discuss upon a global and national scenario. We have a certain level of technical control over our internet thanks to the brilliant work carried out by Nick.br. We have our excellent technical ability. We are acknowledged worldwide, but those who are worried about that is much more the judiciary sector, but that should be expanded and not just restrained to a legal and police officers debate. We have to enlarge that to a cultural, economic, and political debate. And for that, we should leverage a debate addressing national jurisdiction, including the conflict between transnational and national states. Most of the transnational agencies are based in the United States. We also have to discuss upon the cultural jurisdiction. And now Anatel, the carrier, the telco, is addressing the case of Fox, and SEAC, which established some shares for foreigner companies that would like to broadcast their content in a cable TV, and Fox wants to do something else, and they advocated that streaming is something else. So we have to dive into cultural jurisdiction and understand what can be beneficial to the country and not to Fox broadcaster. So we no longer talk about petroleum, iron, or gold, but we keep talking about data and content. We also have to include economic jurisdiction, market power, the main monopolies that are being raised in this market segment. There is no competition if we have a small, tiny group, especially if we are talking about a network economy. And for economists, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is the type of economy which is related directly to that monopoly. And let's not forget addressing our current and regular debate, which is freedom of expression, privacy, human rights, citizenship, all of those being under a certain level of conflict, as well as some other problems that are present nowadays. Having said all of that, I cannot help saying that an internet debate should be expanded. We have to discuss that into details, and we have to understand powers that are dealing with internet into practical terms, but we have to better examine, investigate, and set a political, democratic, and national and international project to be able to cover all these points. Thank you. Next, we are opening for your questions. You can address them in the microphone or remotely. Questions can be asked in English or in Portuguese. Well, I cannot help myself from raising here some very important issues. Our three participants, they address really important aspects. And it's very important to bring together that hatred, the speech, and internet. Thanks to extremes, we are able to deploy different strategies in a more effective and strong way. I agree when Rafael says so. We have talked about that before. Well, in 2011, when everybody else was celebrating about the internet ability to defeat some authoritarian governments, and that was called as being the Arabic Spring, Euseniozov wrote a book called Internet Illusion, addressing exactly the opposite of what mainstream was stating. And that book became very popular at that time. And he mentioned that authoritarian groups, they had already learned to make different use of internet and for their own benefits, to implement and to internet thanks to their own benefits, in a way to guarantee their benefits. And such a relationship to the extremities and the hatred is responsible to drive several things, and there is a relationship. Even in my PhD thesis, I address hate and death, and according to anthropologists, death is seen as a key element to build up mankind. But here we are talking about polarization, and that is present, and we see it. However, what raises my curiosity, Rafael, is that we see advancement of governments of extreme right, but not only in Brazil. We see Brexit and then the European Parliament, Trump in the US, our right wing in Brazil as well. So what is your opinion about that? How come that is happening, since we are talking about two sides of polarization? Now I have a different question to Madeleine. After your talk, I have to say that I do agree that cooperation is in the core of the possible policies that we may implement to get out of some of our problems. When the legal civil framework was implemented in Brazil, we had in mind that intermediates should not become accountable for any sort of information posted by third parties. But now we understand that intermediates, they are somehow liable for what is happening. And we see some international decrees of law, especially in Europe, where they are trying to take liability to those intermediates, to those players. And that worries me quite a lot, because we are pushing ahead public interest in issues to a different level, to autonomous private systems that care about their own personal interests. What is your opinion about that? We even have in Brazil some bills that are turning intermediates liable for that. And here we are not talking anymore about a subjective way. The Article 19 of the legal framework is being questioned now. And what is your opinion about that new perception and how to make intermediates liable for what is informed or posted? To Professor Marcos Dantas, who addresses regulatory models which were implemented by the traditional media, but there is a persistent problem, as you mentioned, which is concentration of political and economic power, which some autonomous systems had embraced after all. What can we do and how can we solve that problem? And then I have one final question, which is quite polemic. We have the telco, Anatel, which advocates for internet, and some of the new disputes, they are over a new layer, which is a business and application layer. Do you believe that CGI.br has any sort of jurisdiction and to be part of this debate over this layer? I want to be a bit polemic here. That's why I'm asking this. Well, as we have here still some unanswered questions. Actually, this is a question from online remote participant. And now I add to this question. He comments about Rafael's talk, when Rafael's talk about the way of power, when users, they seem to be dealing with someone who is not that subject, which ideally would be a 19th century subject. But when we come to the 20th century, that ideal subject had to face some different evidences and proofs, such as some fascist movements and others. And this remote participant says that this dilemma, which you have beautifully summarized, which is similar to the dilemma that we faced in the past, how could we consider about a solution which is similar to the one shared here by Lucas? And how can we oppose that type of power, but not trying to be very elitist, or maybe a solution which does not include or does not go through any sort of strengthening a popular power? As far as I understood, she says, the question has to do with a solution. I mean, how can we have a more inclusive type of solution? So I will start from the last comment, and then I give the floor to my colleagues here. Well, indeed, we have a dilemma. We face one, and we and I also make a comment which is aligned to the question asked to Madeleine. Are we going to save liberal capitalism from itself? I mean, are we going to establish a type of regulatory framework which will allow that subject model sustainability, which is the subject model advocated by psychiatrists and not the big data model, or based on this new subject that we hardly do not know, as there is no evidence, no academic publication, nor reflection about that? Or are we going to raise something else? And I'm not advocating for neither of these answers, as we have just options. But if I consider a society which is running away from the liberal democracy model, going after a different sort of model, I guess that China is attempting to do the same thing. However, I don't see that as a good solution. And that is a step that we institutionally as a country is so far away to consider something like that. If we think about that, that would require a new type of country, and then we would be threatening our own country. I guess that one of the bets of this new idea, where they want to question the public sphere as ethnocentric, from ethnocentric standpoint, that would be a fertile land that could create something democratic and inclusive. And that type of democracy would be different from the so-called liberal democracy. Or maybe we could go after that more immediate and conservative solution, which is to operate or to work in such a way that we can educate that surveillance capitalism, or the new informational type of capitalism, not to destroy our democracy. That sounds quite relevant, and I'm here just repeating a diagnosis of someone who is also worried about liberal democracy, which is Sushana Zub. We have today a challenge, which is to save capitalism from itself, to save liberal institutions, so we then can be able to keep this democratic current perspective and the way we see and understand subjects. We were all raised over this type of democracy, and the parallel to the 20th century and with the fascism, fine. What has, after the two previous world wars, what has the society done? Well, just created mechanisms, technologies, reasoning, philosophies, institutions to avoid the rise of fascism, to avoid that fascism would get back, and to guarantee democracy, the rise of fascism. And a few months ago, Luciana, who works here at CETIC, if I'm not wrong,
falar sobre democracia, diversidade na internet.
sh- we were invited to talk about diversity and internet. And then I brought a very famous text from Bistro that addressed how strong the Western countries could do in terms of including diversity. Western countries, they knew how to add that, and that was published by UNESCO after the Second World War. We were very close to that, and I hope that we can prevent any greater tragedy.
Why is the right growing? I think that, it's bad to say that it's the extremist right wing. I may disagree with them, but we need to respect. Okay, you can disagree. But right now, this more moderate or liberal right is suffering the consequences of the rise of the right extremists. So to me, we don't have that option. Why is the far right doing that, and why is the left failing? Well, because the far right is not mobilizing individuals based on negotiation, understanding, and compromise, so that together we can organize and have a better world. No, they are using on resentment, hatred, so attacking diversity. So I believe that these values are being missed. And I think that that's happening because we are also involved in this machine that involves a lot of energy and excitement. I think that that is very similar to what we used to have before we regulate the communication means, just as we did that. Brazil did not go through that, but the Western world did that. If you go to Europe, well, there are a set of rules. For example, if you want to have a TV broadcast station and things like that. And that's why our scenario here in Brazil is very different and worse. Not to mention, all the inequalities that we see here in Brazil. Thank you. Well, I believe that the question to me represents another talk. But let me start by talking censorship to intermediates, because that allows me to tie my talk to what Rafael just mentioned. when the so-called traditional media emerged, they were new at a certain point, right? So in the past, they were open, they were free. It was open to anybody, anything. And in the US, well, there is information from 1927 in which many families and people, they actually had amateur radio stations. They did not have any commercial radio. So they could use the radio to listen and to talk. And then there was a regulation that was determined by the market. Because the market, well, discovered that if you have 6 million people talking and listening, well, that represents a means for you to make money, to profit from that. And that's when they learned that that could be used for advertising purposes. And that's when they regulate the radio. Well, considering the social political scenario at that time, that led to development of a technical layer at that time represented by frequencies and a layer of content. The layer of contents, if we pay attention, they did not require any censorship from the state because there was an internal censorship coming from hierarchies and bureaucracy. So you have an internal power structure that knows, and if you go into that when you're young, you're going to learn what you can and what you cannot do. And if you do not know what you can say or what you cannot say, there is somebody above you that will tell you what you can and what you cannot say. And for example, if you go today to newspapers and radios, you also have a system that in which you have filters established. And just as in the current Brazilian Constitution, we have an almost complete freedom of expression. But in real life, that's not really true, because if you think about the different media communication companies, they do have their own set of rules that determine what they're going to publish or what's going to be made public. So these are filters. And today what we see is, so when the internet emerged, that was used only by educated people, by the academia. So the conversation, the dialogue was very educated. But today it's open. And what we see today is really almost a nightmare. But this is not, it's not the technology that is producing that. Well, the internet was not necessary for us having the French Revolution or the American Industrial Revolution. So today what we see is this social rupture. So what we see is the society being broken. Same thing with regard to the work environment. A very poor working conditions. And this is what is actually creating this dimension in society in which you find people who are resented, who do not feel themselves represented, and that are expressing themselves now. So we have this technology that is helping this development, dissemination of all this. Let's think about what happened in Germany in the 30s. These type of people, they can be easily handled, and they may be led to the extreme, for the far right extremism. And that's what happened with Nazism. And we need to pay close attention to that. To me, this is an announced tragedy. I'm so sorry, but I'd say that we really need to pay close attention to what's going on. And that's not a product of the technology itself, but it's actually the product of neoliberalism and globalization. And technology is helping to disseminate everything. And we need also to distinguish, to separate the intermediate. We do need to do that. We have the technicians who are neutral with regards to content, just as Nick, and those who are not neutral when it comes to content, with regard to content. Facebook is not neutral. They have a censorship. And they can actually upload or just content or just delete content. Same thing for Twitter, for any other platform. They are already editing things. We need to see that. And that's why I believe that we do need regulation. A very specific regulation for this specific layer. And if you think about Brazil today, we have a legislation ruling subscription TV. But what we need is actually a regulation. I do not know whether we need a new agency just to take care of that. Maybe CGI, because CGI, we know it's a very democratic. And it's important that we have the different stakeholders involved, or to have a board represented by different stakeholders. But that's important so that we can progress, because right now Brazil is going backwards. We are going backwards 70 years in just 2 years. Oh, you mentioned concentration also. We are facing a huge challenge. Economists know that what we have tends to monopolies. And the net market tends to monopolies. And what we know is that we need to make a decision. Do we want a private or a public monopoly? Monopolies were either taken over by the government, or if we think about what happened in the US, for example, involving the AT&T, for example, they had to accept some public rules in order to keep working, still as a monopoly. But anyway, I do not really believe in the solutions that are being proposed, which is to fragment monopolies, particularly when you think about the content layer, because they guide themselves based on this internet market. And there are also very reasonable explanations for that. Thank you.
Well, after those wonderful words of warning, just a few remarks of my side. First of all, the internet service provider remark of yours. Well, we have experience within Europe, that's my role here today, that indeed the liability of internet service providers is enlarged, though there's more situations where you will be held liable. And in this copyright directive, where we also touched upon this morning, it is made very explicit that also internet service providers can be held liable directly, although they are just in a situation where they don't have control over the content. So that is touched upon something which was very sensitive in Europe, and that was that there is a great fear for a chilling effect, that then the platforms such as YouTube will then start, well, forms of private censorship to avoid to be held liable. So there is a risk, of course, to that, and also to start filtering information, because if they don't have a permission of a copyright owner, they are supposed to take it out, the information, if it's still on the internet, and if they don't do that, they're held liable. So then they might start using artificial intelligence filter systems to take out that information. So there's a lot of discussion in Europe, where we all love the freedom of information, whether this is a good idea. But then again, it also depends of how it will be implemented in the national member states, whether this will actually be as harmful as some people fear it will be. So that's my reaction to the internet service provider discussion. One most important thing is that please provide solutions to avoid chilling effects, and that would connect to your topic as well, Professor, is that, you know, censorship is not a good idea, nor for private actors, nor for public actors. And what we have seen is that Facebook, for instance, is now, and also Google tried to do that, create a new system of a sort of an internal court to, you know, to make the right decisions. And we have been talking to them, and we have advised them to live up to the rules of the European Court of Human Rights. You know, because if they use those rules as a guideline, then it's much less worth than if they have their own censorship systems, which I know they don't really want either. But, and that's the last remark towards your presentation, Professor, is that if there's a lot of pressure, state pressure towards the private actors to take out information, like Macron and also the German legislators have suggested and is in fact implemented in the law, then you will have another situation where the public push will create private censorship at the end of the day. And I think that's not something what we would want around the table, because then we would be throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Brings me to the last point, also directing towards your presentation, which I found very interesting. And you were saying you had an analogy, and you had two analogies. In fact, one was with regard to, well, the internet is now like a city. This is how it looks. It's different buildings, different, well, quality of buildings. That's what you said on the one hand. And on the other hand, you said, well, it is like, what were your wordings? It is the free marketplace of ideas. But you concluded that since it was a city, it needed to have some sort of state regulation. But I would say, given the other analogy you would use, like the free marketplace of ideas, we would not want anti-interference in this free market place of ideas, because that is self-saluting. It can solve its problems by itself. You would have free marketplace of ideas, one part of ideas on this side of the spectrum, and the other part of the ideas would be on the other spectrum, and then it would level out. So I was just wanting to comment that I understand your need and your push for regulation, but please be aware that in fact you would be regulating, if you're not careful, this free marketplace of ideas, and this is something I think you also don't want to do.
Are there any other questions? Yes, I'd like to first of all to commend the three speakers for their presentation. I'm a lawyer, so when you think about the use of filters, what about the ideology that would determine that filter, what you can and what you cannot do? Who would make that type of decision? I believe that that's also tied to the question sent over the internet. So, doesn't it take a public manifestation to have the general society involved? Because that's what we'll need. Well, and also in having people voting and choosing their representatives. But as a lawyer, I know that this is very hard, particularly when it comes to how this is going to be interpreted and what can be considered possible or not possible, or allowed or not allowed. When the state tries to regulate, it goes, well, there is self-promotion and censorship. And there is a very thin line between the two sides. So let's say if you have a fascist that is disseminating his ideas. Now, what if it's this fascist guy who is actually determining the filter ideology? If he is in power today and if he is implementing this rule, how can we avoid that this set of rules will actually backfire us? And just to finish, with regard to internet service providers, all of them have their internal set of rules. Facebook, just to mention, they cannot publish the pictures of naked people, for example. And there are, for example, some memes in which, if they see, for example, an elbow, they will delete that, for example. But when it comes to elections, there is another issue. What is your opinion and what is false? This is something I'm going to discuss in the next panel. Well, the Brazilian legislation and also the legal framework, they do not have those internet service providers. And because they are not aware of everything that is published, because you have zillions of data being published every minute. So why not use the system of notes and takedowns? So if the service provider issue is, I didn't know this was being displayed in my platform. If the person who feels offended presents a notification that is much faster than any legal process, if you send a notification to your service provider, this piece of news is offensive or is fake news, from that point on, the internet service provider, the platform, can no longer state that they were not aware of that post. And because of that, they at least go back to the person who posted that and say, well, somebody's complaining about your post. So I'd like to hear from you what you think about this type of measure, a note and take down.
Mais alguém?
Boa tarde. Primeiro, parabenizar a todos pelas palestras.
Congratulations to all of you. Very nice talks. I'd like to hear your ideas about a problem which will become even worse in the next elections, such as the deepfakes. What sort of discussion should we have now to decelerate the problem of disinformation in the next Brazilian elections?
So let's give it a try on the notice and takedown. Because that is actually what is the system in Europe right now. So if there is, you are notified as an internet service provider of the fact that there is illegal content, which could be hate speech or copyrighted material, and you don't take it out, you can then be held liable. The problem is, however, that if in that case it is up to the internet service provider to judge, and you are a judge because we had dinner just now, so you used to be a judge, and then the judging of the legitimately of the claim would then be in the hands of Facebook, Google, or the internet service provider we're dealing with. Because then in that case, they decide to take it out or not. And the risk of the chilling effect is exactly that they are inclined to take it out rather sooner than later. So therefore, I would say we have to be a little bit careful with this notice and take down proceedings as well, because they could amount to a chilling effect. Of course, we know this girl from Vietnam, the naked Vietnamese girl that is running away from napalm, which is on her body, and Facebook just took that off. The algorithm took it off. And we want to avoid situations where that would happen, or where would someone say, okay, but this is a naked girl, take her off. No, we need to have that because we need to see what actually was going on in that war. So that's what I would like to comment on that point. And the last comment of me on you would be that your first remark to with regulation, I completely agree and can only say, hear, hear, your honor. So I agree with that. Thank you.
Well.
Eu queria comentar sobre essa
I'd like to make an additional comment about what you have just said. If the Nazis were the ones to make the filters, maybe we have here two different scenarios. First, a precondition, which is a democratic state. And I liked your comment about laws and mechanisms of participation. A required and demanded step is to have a constitution for all these mechanisms. If you have a non-democratic state, everything else will be non-democratic, and the context will never be a democratic one. I reinforce the fact of the state, even considering the Brazilian society. The civil society can only express itself freely in a very representative way of their own interests, if that is somehow protected by a democratic state. Without a democratic state, there is no civil society that will survive, as any market pressures or a non-authoritarian state will hinder that civil society, which will no longer be a full civil society. And there is something else that I would like to point out, which is we have to do something over economic stimuli, which is being said in face of what is fake, false, and that sensational news, they refer to groups that may be working with information, misinformation, considering a political influence, which will later on add some economic gains. And that is a democracy dilemma in general lines. And I fully agree with Professor Marcos when he says that was not up to the internet who created those problems, and now we have to do something over it, otherwise it will keep on offering stimulus which will render room for those who are rather radical. And now a comment about deep fakes. I don't know how to answer that huge problem. And deep fakes can be even worse to us, as a great part of our population is not used to reading. They consume information by video and images. They talk by themselves. Academics, they replicate that idea despite an image being captured by a technical device that may show fake images. Still, that gives a real effect, and that cannot be denied. How are you lying to me? I saw that. I saw a picture of it or an image. And we had lots of misinformation during the past elections when we have changed memes, and I guess that deepfakes will represent a problem in our next elections and as a whole. and we have to be very careful in the next elections, which is zero rating. Zero rating someone has a very cheap internet plan, and their credits just run off, and then they have WhatsApp and Facebook for free. How can they check any sort of information? We have a prior problem, which is immediate training and education of some subject to understand what is supposed to be real or not. And similarly, you have someone who is hooked to a WhatsApp channel that works like a TV set. If you get anyone's telephone number who's got several WhatsApp groups, the football group, the building group, neighbors discussion group, and so on and so forth. And in each one of the groups, they will address different contents, specific issues, and also some other issues such as videos, and that ends up being a TV set. And zero rating talks exactly about that, and we have to prohibit it. That's my opinion. Well, I think now it's up to me to close the session and some closing remarks. Rafael has a point, and no issues being discussed here. They are based on a liberal democracy. This is our main issue. But then when you talk about the state members, but here I'm talking about a liberal democratic state. And we have to accept that as being a state with their own room for participation, discussion, debate, and organization. We want to improve it somehow, to sophisticate it. And as part of that, we have very good examples of content regulation in some liberal states, such as England and some other European countries, that they have some previous history. They know what they are doing. And similarly, we are facing a new reality, and as Rafael just said, some of these issues, they have to be prohibited, full stop, such as deepfake. Some images that are shown in the YouTube are just horrible, unacceptable. And private organizations such as media companies, some of those issues, they are not accepted. Some newspapers, they accept it, some others do not. There are those that they want to be more sensationalist, and there is no censorship. But that is somehow an internal censorship. And what will regulate that internal censorship? A society common sense. I am a journalist. I know what will shock my reader. So please don't post that, don't show that image. That is a censorship which sometimes is not shown, and there will be someone in my publishing that will not allow this or that. So a certain framework and regulatory approach has to be respected, discussed, and has to comply with a society common sense. And here I'm talking about a liberal democratic society. And there are several good examples as how we can do that, especially in a liberal democratic Western European countries. About notice and take down, I personally think differently. If there is something which I do not like, I just go and announce it. No, if I don't like it, I have to sue it. I have to go to the court. According to a liberal, democratic country, you have to have that issue judged. So you have to claim to the court. Otherwise, that will be just personal initiatives, retaliation, leading to some other problems. So with that, I close the session. I thank you, Professor Madeleine, for your timely comments, and thank you so much to all participants.